Cities for the 21st Century. Gathering stones from the fields is something people have been doing for thousands of years, removing and amassing them to clear the land and to prepare it for planting, and no less important, to separate, to protect, and to build. The Romans were especially adept at building in stone. Yet after the invasion of the barbarous hordes, this Roman legacy was nearly lost forever. However, in the late Middle Ages, in so many places around Europe, people remembered the forms of those ancient Roman temples, and that is why the incipient architectural style of that period is known as the Romanesque. So much time has passed that not much from that era is still standing. But one Spanish city still preserves the greatest number of Romanesque churches in all of Europe. No fewer than 22. Zamora, memory in stone. The origins of Zamora can be traced back to an ancient hamlet called Castile. The Romans took up residence sometime later, around 200 BC. Then it would become an important Visigothic settlement. Following the Battle of Calatayud, the Moors presided over a period of unprecedented development. However, in the 13th century, Zamora would fall victim to the devastating forces of decadence and negligence. In the late Middle Ages, life was fraught with insecurity. Plagues, diseases of all kinds, rampant infections, brutal invasions, starvation. Many sought to flee the anguish of their daily life by turning to God, and the manifestation of this is most patent in the churches they built. Often the church was the only stone building for miles around. It was always the tallest and most solemn edifice on the horizon. The bell tower served as a kind of visual reference for travelers coming from afar. If we imagine ourselves in those times, we might be able to picture just how impressive a city like Zamora must have been, with so many imposing churches. The churches then were stout structures, solid constructions built for defense, much like the castles or city walls of the era. Though of course they were actually built to protect against evil spirits, calamities, and the persecution of justice. Inside, they were almost always structured around a central aisle leading to an apse. That's where the main altar was situated, which with rare exceptions would point towards the east. The construction style was Romanesque, but Gothic architecture would soon appear. Many of the churches in Zamora tend to be high and narrow, so that the optical effect is one suggesting slenderness combined with great amounts of space overhead, something that inevitably required admirers to look up. It also suggested the invisible presence of the spiritual world. Just as with the bridges of the era, the lateral pressure of the churches anchored the stones of the main building. But since the vaults were so heavy, it occurred to someone that the best solution was to build solid arches, fill in the spaces between them with lighter weight material, and place lateral buttresses along the walls where the greatest amount of weight had to be counterbalanced. That must not have been a bad idea, because today, 1,000 years later, these churches are still there, supporting their incredibly weighty vaults. In those days, almost no one knew how to read, so the relief work and the capitals proved an opportunity to remind people of biblical scenes. But since the church leaders weren't able to depict all of them, they would choose the most significant vignettes. In this case, over a tomb, it's possible to see above the deceased a representation of a soul escorted by the angels. One has to imagine how the prelates of the day would explain to farmers and shepherds just who those characters were and what they meant within the sacred story. The artists of the day were true geniuses in the art of synthesizing. In other cities, progress has destroyed many old churches, but Zamora was trapped in the past. That is its bane, yet also its good fortune. In a way, having been forgotten is what allows us to enjoy today the medieval wonder and abundance of its churches. Despite the fact that, on occasion, the price of rapid development has resulted in a less than dignified fit. Visiting Zamora means strolling through a city that seems to effortlessly straddle both provincial life and the cutting-edge modernity of anywhere else. Well-known brand-name shops, where with each passing day, it's more probable to find the same thing big cities offer. And also unique products. For centuries, Zamoran blankets ensured the sound sleep of countless Spaniards. Today, these quilts have become prized souvenirs. Pedestrian Streets, an afternoon hotbed of human activity. When children get out of school, people leave work, and it's time to do some shopping or take a walk. The city is proud because more than one world champion kayaker was born in Zamora. In the Middle Ages, the Duero River was a true border. Its abundant flow was not easy to ford, and Zamora was watched closely from the south. The south was controlled by the Moors. That's where the city's vocation as a bastion of Christianity comes from. The restored river mills look like stone boats standing against the current. They were used to mill wheat, and they were able to transform hydraulic power into mechanical power. Some local residents joke that Zamora has only two seasons, winter and hunting. But that's not true. In summer, people swim in the river or stroll along Pelambres Beach, which is referred to, tongue-in-cheek of course, as Benidorm. And in the spring, Zamorans love to take part in processions, to go to the country with a family and have a fresh air picnic. The Valorio Forest is one of the most typical places to do so. And it is so close by that it is practically a prolongation of the city. The heroic stone islets that still withstand the force of the river current are the visible vestiges of the old Roman bridge. By comparison, the stone bridge is very young. It's only 900 years old. It was built in the 12th century, and none of its 15 archways is the same as any other. For decades, the statue known as Pero Mato was located above this bridge, but it was later moved. While the original is now in the Museum of Zamora, the copy stands guard over the city from on high. The walls of Zamora are still quite impressive. For a long time, Zamora was known as Bien Cercada, or the well-fortified. Currently, the walls surround only part of the city, but their solid, robust appearance makes one think how difficult it must have been to try and get over them. art and technical drawing students often sketch near the walls, and some of them draw the castle, which occasionally serve to protect the population. The perspective is not altered. From the air, the castle is a perfect diamond. The Cathedral of Zamora is like the prow of the city in its nautical-like stance above the Duero. Its magnificent rear facade is Romanesque. However, the front facade dates from much later and opens out onto an immense public square. The tower is of special note. 33 meters high, its role was dual, ecclesiastical and defensive. But deserving of even more attention is the very original dome, which lights the junction of the main aisle with the crossing like a lantern. This is a structure that has no equal in medieval art. Semi-spherical and canted, it has 16 windows and is decorated with stone scales. Its impressive beauty, of Eastern influence, was imitated in several other cathedrals and collegiate churches. For starters, the Cathedral of Zamora is the smallest and the oldest of all the cathedrals in Castile and Leon. Nevertheless, its interior is filled with impressive treasures. In stone, the tomb of Dr. Grado is especially outstanding. It has one of the finest sepulchral murals dating from the late Spanish Gothic period. Iron was shaped with incredible virtuosity. The ironwork of the main chapel is one of the most important architectural sets from the early Plateresque period. Part of its treasures are the fabrics and silks and its marvelous Flemish tapestries. Apart from the stonework and the fabrics is the wood, the choir. The choir stalls were carved from cedar wood in the workshop of John of Brussels exactly 500 years ago. The whole is dedicated to the Savior, and several different artisans participated in sculpting it. Beneath the rigor and solemnity of the statues of prophets, patriarchs, and kings, in small places that were not so easily seen, such as the misericords and the arms on the choir stalls, there is a set of profane figures, some of which are truly surprising. Some of these scenes are scatological, others sarcastic, but all of them are very imaginative and extremely well done. Bread, cheese, wine. That's what makes traveling fine. There's nothing more Castilian, nor anything that might evoke the old collection of ballads, than these three elements, which we find here in abundance, besides roasts, typical codfish dishes, and the age-old standby garlic soup. This is a gastronomy that has evolved, but which is still linked to medieval times. Lambs bring to mind the principal treasures of Zamora. From them came wool, the local blankets, and of course the region's famous cheese. Pigeons, pigeon roosts, birds raised over the centuries that formed a key part of the daily diet, have inspired a kind of folk architecture that is currently being rediscovered. Outside Zamora, there are beautiful and nutritious routes of interest: lamb, wheat fields, pigeon roosts, and grapevines. Toro, known for its wines, still preserves its medieval outline. The dome of its collegiate church doesn't try and hide its similarity to the one in the province's capital. The Villa Fafila lagoons cover more than 500 hectares. From the Interpretation Center, it is possible to contemplate nature without disturbing it too much. The low demographic density of the province of Zamora has an obvious advantage: the abundance of nature. The always skittish great bustards wander around the fields of Villafafila. The effort of its flight is incredible. As is well known, it is the heaviest of all birds on the Iberian Peninsula, a kind of jumbo amongst all the other species.
Navegaremos en aguas internacionales hispano-rusas. Pedimos la colaboración de todos para mantenerse durante el recorrido en completo silencio. Hablará solamente el guía, de esta manera mantendremos la locución lo más baja posible y también en este sentido navegaremos.
In the Arribes del Duero, there is a magnificent canyon between Spain and Portugal. The inaccessibility of the peaks has served to keep this area practically virgin. The boat that cruises the Arribes affords one a privileged point of view, excellent for bird watching in a natural setting. The corresponding conservation project is paid for through tourism, and this is an example of a sensible symbiosis between visitors and nature. If we return to the city, we'll be able to see that besides its Romanesque side, there's much more. Civilian Gothic architecture in Momo's Palace. A mysterious coincidence, which in what has been designated only recently as the Palace of Justice, has as its principal adornment from the 15th century, chains. The old City Hall building is Zamora's largest Renaissance palace. In front of it is the new one. In fact, the town's Plaza Mayor, or main square, marks the nexus between the old and new quarters. In the old city, there are other vestiges from the Renaissance period. Today, this is the courtyard of a national parador, a state-run hotel, but in its time, it was the townhouse of the Counts of Alba and Aliste. As we walk down narrow streets that once formed part of the Jewish quarter, it's hard not to remember that Zamora once had as many as 19 synagogues, although the intransigence of Ferdinand and Isabella made sure that today there's not even one. Viriato is a Portuguese hero, or perhaps he was from Zamora. No one really knows. Of course, that's easy to understand given the lack of a birth certificate, which Spain and Portugal hadn't even invented yet. But Viriato successfully confronted the Romans, and his arm stands out on the city's coat of arms. In what was once the Hospital of the Incarnation, the classical lines of the courtyard contrast with the emotive statue by the sculptor Ramon Abrantes. A discrete wave of wealth washed over Zamora at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Balborraz Street could practically compare to any Central European city street. Its shops and homes suggest good taste and a life of quality. As in many other cities, bourgeois growth at the beginning of the 20th century gave rise to a style that was at once audacious and groundbreaking. In Zamora, there is a little-known modernism that is both interesting and surprising. Spanish modernism, or Art Nouveau, is something that one wouldn't immediately imagine finding in cities in Old Castile. A round-trip ticket, the theater, which was actually built as such, was then turned into a cinema and turned back into a theater again. The university. The campus of Zamora University, which administratively belongs to the University of Salamanca. The stair as a seat, the pit at the center of campus, a modern simulation of the Greek theaters, the amateur group of students that only hopes to practice a bit and have some fun. Zamora is a small city. The beautiful adaptation of what once were grandiose barracks doesn't seem to correspond to the small number of students. Here's the splendid facade of the Palace of the Court, but what's behind it? Seen from here, one can't imagine that he stands before one of the provincial museums that has best managed to combine the modern style of its architecture with the ancient nature of its holdings. The provincial museums in Spain are much more than modest storehouses for the finest archaeological heritage of a given province. Their holdings come from discoveries, but also from donations. They are heartwarming and didactic. They practically never seek to be protagonists, but the sum of all of them constitutes a vast national treasure.
¿Juráis silencio durante el recorrido de esta santa procesión?
Sobriety, seriousness. While Holy Week commemorates a tragedy the world over, in these streets, it is felt as if it occurred here. It's impossible to escape the contained breath of the entire city. Everything seems somehow overwhelmed, expectant, like a breath that's being held in. If Holy Week in Zamora is considered one of the most famous Easter celebrations, it's because of that special emotional attitude expressed by its residents. During Holy Week, the entire city participates. Of its 70,000 inhabitants, over 35,000 walk in the processions. If you take away the elderly, the sick, and small children, it's not difficult to calculate and determine that the entire city pulses beneath the light of the hassocks. What is really impressive here, causing your pulse to beat faster, is the collective sentiment that, over 7 days, runs through the city like a wave, a slow wave of contained pain that directly complements what is being represented. In Zamora, Holy Week is above all a state of being, solemn, cathartic, prisoner of itself, and appropriate. Identifying with it all is so authentic that this is not just the commemoration of Christ's passion, it is passion itself, the crying, the fits of passion, sacrifice, and the pain of Calvary. The barandales starts off many of the processions in Zamora, and it has become one of the most singular figures in the city, to the point of being considered the subject of a statue. The Christs and Virgins are venerated in each church, but they've taken this a step further here by building floats that correspond to the key moments of the Passion. These are scenes in 3 dimensions that are constructed according to the canons of Baroque set design, shapes that lie somewhere between realism and caricature. Many of the floats are very, very old, while others have been made recently. In the middle of the night, the Miserere breaks the silence. This modern ethnological museum of Castile and Leon arose from the love for tradition. It's a modern building in which the ways of life and the objects characterizing them are given their due. They honor the rural past, not so far removed, and yet at the same time so far in the distance. Articles that were once useful long ago, and whose rapid obsolescence is the other side of the coin of development.
Es una cama de la provincia de León, es del siglo XIX y tiene una decoración única. No se ha encontrado ningún ejemplar parecido todavía. Ven que está decorada con ángeles.
In what once were the ruins of a Franciscan monastery, we find the King Alfonso Enriquez Foundation, dedicated to fomenting cultural and scientific projects between Spain and Portugal. The building makes a virtue out of combining architectural extremes, inserting the historical into the modern, dignifying the ruins, framing its lines. Another example. Today, this is a modern hotel. But before, it was an alcohol plant, and long before that, a light factory. Listen to that. It sounds like the title of a poem, The Light Factory, as poetic as the vault in the building's restaurant. Romanesque, industrialization, postmodern. This sums up Zamora, the Zamora that was, and the Zamora that wants to be. Someone sits on a bench and writes a friend, perhaps to send a brief note about the city. Zamora, a border town, beyond winter, beyond the river, over an impregnable time, for centuries the well fortified, and today so very within reach.